Now we're going to call Dr. John Ashton. He will be joining us this morning to have a conversation about foods, but not the kind of food you're thinking. I'm actually going to ask Dr. John about why does God classify some animals as clean and unclean. This seems to be something quite unique to the Bible, and I'm wondering, is it just an arbitrary decision, or is there more to the story? Dr. John, welcome to the Breakfast Show. It's great to have you with us.
Good morning. Yes.
So, Dr. John, tell us a little bit about that, because I met, some people, they such as the Seventh-day Adventists, for example, they look at the Leviticus 11 prohibitions in terms of the kinds of meats that God allowed and didn't allow, and they follow that, they respect that. But so many other Christians say, look, this is just Old Testament. This is not a thing this day and age. A lot of the world, actually, I believe that pork is the number one most consumed type of meat worldwide. In Australia, we have other things that Leviticus prohibits eating, for example, shellfish and shrimps, calamari. We have entire restaurants that are dedicated based on that. I'm wondering here, are those who are trying to follow Leviticus 11 missing out on anything? Where do these commandments come from? Is there any logic behind them? Can you tell us a little bit more about what does God have to say about kinds of meats that are appropriate to human consumption and the ones that are not?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it's a pretty broad topic there, and there hasn't been a lot of research done in some of these areas from the point of view of why shouldn't we eat these foods. The main area ones are perhaps shellfish, red meat and pork, as you said. They're the main ones. We haven't done studies on why you shouldn't eat, the birds of prey, and things like this, and pelicans. But there are some general principles that we can look at here, and I think there's first of all, we need to say that this is not really part of the plan of salvation. So people aren't, you don't get to heaven by not eating certain foods and this sort of thing.
It's not a moral issue.
Well, that's right. Yes, that's right. And that's important to understand that. But there are some very, very good health principles here. And I think just to look at the big picture first, when these animals were eaten in the past, cooking methods were fairly limited, and these animals, all these animals have what we call a microbiome, and so they have bacteria in them, and they have them in various parts, in various organs too. It's not just the gut, just like we do. Have bacteria in different parts of our body other than just the digestive system. And these, certain of these animals, particularly, animals of carrion, like your birds of prey and a lot of your water birds, these sort of things, are going to be carrying bacteria that are likely to be highly toxic to us, highly poisonous to us. And one of the common ones, of course, we associate with food would be salmonella. But there are lots of other very, very harmful, very, very toxic bacteria that are getting around, where the immune systems in these animals are coping with these bacteria, but we're not going to. Another one, if we look at, say, the animals, we need to understand too that God, again applies with the flesh of certain animals, the cleanliness of those animals. These sort of things would be involved, and I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk perhaps about pork. But the other aspect is, if we start perhaps with red meat, is that when animals are killed, a lot of animals know that they're going to be killed, and so there's a lot of other hormones, other compounds that are released into the bloodstream. Secondly, the bloodstream is carrying all the metabolic waste products for those animals, and so And a lot of these are ideally not good for us. And so that's why God recommended, okay, if you are going to eat meat, remove the blood from the meat as part of the process of eating the meat. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting that more studies are being done, particularly on red meat now. So if we think of traditional red meat as beef, veal, pork, lamb, mutton, these sort of foods, of course, more you can have venison and some of these other things, but they're the main ones we would eat. And it's quite an interesting number of studies have been done. And if we look at just standard red meat, which are those, and then we have the processed meats, such as ham, sausages, bacon, Frankfurt salami, and so forth. There's actually quite a difference there as well. But there's quite a bit of research being done on this. And one major paper, the major review paper, that was published a few years ago, showed that the consumption of just normal red meat, that's not the processed meat, it's just your standard chops and so forth.
Yes.
And steak, 100 grams a day, increased the risk of stroke by 11%, and also 11% for breast cancer, 15% for cardiovascular mortality, 17% for colorectal cancer, 19% for advanced prostate cancer. So here we see that the consumption of these foods, this is the red meat proportion, significantly increased those cancers, heart disease and stroke. And a lot of this,
I remember that around that time, a lot of the regulatory bodies were classifying just red meats in different ways. I remember that the famous Harvard food groups pyramid, they removed meat from pretty much the middle of the pyramid to the level of just occasional eating, so almost like outside of the pyramid. And I think it was as a response of the wave of studies such as this one that came out, wasn't it?
Yes. No, well, this was a major review study that's published, just a few years ago now. I think it was either 2017. And there have probably been other ones, but that's the one that, I had handy and to get this data from. And the interesting thing is that when you went to processed meats, just a consumption of 50 grams a day of a processed meat increased those risks, so increased those values, increased prostate cancer risk by a further 4%, and general cancer by 8% for breast cancer, 18% for colorectal cancer, 19% increase for pancreatic cancer, 13% increase for stroke, and 24% increase for cardiovascular mortality, and 32% increased risk for diabetes. Now, of course, the processed meats have lots of preservatives and these sort of things in them, so we're perhaps getting away from the biblical account there. But it's interesting to realise that these dangers are there. And God, I guess, initially wanted us to have a plant-based diet. When we come to pork's quite an interesting one that's been studied for a long period of time, because it's pigs can be raised intensively, very easily, and so forth. And it's interesting, a high percentage of people really like, bacon and so forth. And, of course, bacon is a processed food as well. But if we look just at pork itself, there's a very, very high risk, or a very much increased risk of hepatitis. It's estimated that about 20 million people a year are infected with hepatitis E from eating.
Oh, really? I never knew that was this connection between what kind of hepatitis it is again?
Hepatitis E.
Mm-hmm.
And that can lead to sort of fever, fatigue, jaundice, vomiting, joint pain, stomach pain, enlarged liver.
And do we know what exactly present in the flesh of swines that may cause that hepatitis? Is it a bacteria driven, or is it something else? Do we know that?
Yes, it seems that one of the things is that the pigs themselves are contaminated with hepatitis E.
I see. Because look, I remember.
But it's also carried. It's also, there are other things. There are particular. Yes, this is one of the main things, that the hepatitis E regularly shows up in the analysis of pork meat itself. So that's one of the factors. And the thing is, with the hepatitis E virus, it can survive, fairly high cooking temperatures as well. So for example, I think you've got to have, cook it for at least 20 minutes at a fairly high temperature to make sure that the virus is destroyed. And one of the problems that they have, there's some subtle things. The other thing we were advised to do is to cut the fat off the meat. And it's interesting that the hepatitis virus can be protected by fat as well. So, and therefore survive. So yes, it's quite complex. One of the other things that's a little bit scary is that there's a very strong link between pork consumption and multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disease. The mechanism for this is more based on epidemiological studies. In other words, populations that have a high consumption of pork have much higher intakes of multiple sclerosis. And the paper I was reading, there was a very strong correlation of 0.87 in association with multiple sclerosis and pork. So the debate is still open on this, but it's quite interesting. So that's another one that's associated with pork consumption around the world.
That's very interesting, because a lot of people say, look, a lot of people, when they're talking about the risks of pork meat, they say, look, yes, there's risks of parasitical infections that can be harmful to human beings if it's consumed raw. But as long as you're cooking everything well, there's nothing to worry about. But as you're saying, that there are risks that are even further from those classical risks that have been quite widely publicized, particularly with hepatitis C, which can be very hard to be destroyed even when cooking at high temperatures.
The connection between multiple sclerosis and pork has certainly been investigated. One of the areas is that there's a particular bacteria that pigs can carry, a Cyanonet bacteria. And one of the things that this particular bacteria has compounds that mimic the myelin in the brain. And so this bacteria are found particularly in pig feces on pig farms, and tends to be a spoilage organism. And that seems to be one of the pathways that a Cyanonet bacteria transmission increases this risk. Another study is that they think that pigs may be carriers of particular prions. So these are small pieces of protein that are like a virus, and they carry genetic information. And we know that these proteins are associated with other neurodegenerative disorders like the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and so forth, that are particularly found in cannibalistic societies in the past. So these are another areas. And I think one of the things is that, pigs aren't usually raised in super hygienic, conditions. And so this is another area. Anyway, there is that strong association. Another very interesting one is a very strong association between pork consumption and liver cancer and cirrhosis. Interesting. And so, again, these are other areas that are being studied, but there's quite again, very strong statistical link between pork consumption and liver cancer and cirrhosis. Some of the things that they think it might be mainly connected, particularly with bacon consumption and processed pork products.
Very interesting. So, Dr. John, what is like we are running out of time. I would love to continue that conversation because we're just scratching the surface on this research. But what would you be your advice, from in regards to people that are considering their intake of particularly pork meat What would you be a sensitive approach to that, particularly from a Bible perspective? What would be your opinion?
Well, I think it's certainly wise to avoid, pork, all these things are dose related, of course. The more pork you eat, the bigger the risk. But I think it's certainly interesting that God advised on this. We haven't spoken about shellfish, but again, shellfish can be, high consumption, tend to be filter organisms. They tend to have high levels of the heavy metals, for example, if they're in the environment, and also very, very high levels of quite nasty bacteria and these sort of things. So again,
we definitely have to save that one for our next interview about shellfish, because I think
I think the biblical principles have certainly been borne out by scientific research over the years, and God gave them to us because He loves us, and He wanted Israel to stand out as a very, very healthy group of people. And one of the ways to do that was to not eat these foods that increase the risk of disease.
Dr. John, thank you so much for all of this very interesting information here about, why would God say about that certain kinds of meats were unclean.
You're listening to the Breakfast Show podcast on Faith FM. Positively different.
We're now going to be